Now, right after it passed, Judge Carter and I were a part of a press conference, and our Attorney General, Greg Abbott, was one of the first attorneys general to step forward and say, under the Commerce Clause, I don't think you can do this. And he wrote a very powerful letter to our two senators earlier in the year, and I just wanted to quote a couple of paragraphs from this very thoughtful and lengthy letter that Greg Abbott wrote to our senators. He writes, "The individual mandate is constitutionally suspect because it does not fall into any of the normal categories. The mandate provision of H.R. 3590 attempts to regulate a non-activity." Let me just stop for a second. Attempts to regulate a non-activity. Are there any other non-activities we do during the course of the day that we're willing to give over the regulation of those non-activities to the federal government? I think the judge already made the point. Of course there are not. Continuing to quote from the letter, the legislation actually imposes a financial penalty upon Americans who choose not to engage in interstate commerce because they choose not to enter into a contract for health insurance. Quoting further, in other words, the proposed mandate would compel nearly every American to engage in commerce by forcing them to purchase insurance and then use that coerced transaction as the basis for claiming authority under the Commerce Clause. Continuing to quote from Greg Abbott's letter, Congress's own independent nonpartisan research agency, the Congressional Research Service, expressed doubts about the Commerce Clause applicability in a report issued last July. Despite the breadth of powers that have been exercised under the Commerce Clause, it is unclear that the clause would provide a solid constitutional foundation for legislation containing a requirement to have health insurance. It may be argued that the mandate goes beyond the bounds of the Commerce Clause. And then finally, just to conclude from Greg Abbott's letter, if there are to be any limitations on federal government, let me just underscore that any one more time. If there are to be any limitations on the federal government, then commerce cannot be construed to cover every possible human activity under the sun, including mere human existence. The act of doing absolutely nothing does not constitute an act of commerce that Congress is authorized to regulate.